tropical river valleys would you have found the squatting lairs of his little herds, a male, a few females, a child or so. He knew no future then, no kind of life except the life he led. He fled the cave bear over the rocks full of iron ore and the promise of sword and spear. He froze to death upon a ledge of coal. He drank water muddy with the clay that would one day make cups of porcelain. He chewed the ear of wild weed he had plucked and gazed with a dim speculation in the eyes at the birds that soared beyond his reach. Or suddenly he became aware of the scent of another male and rose up roaring, his roars the formless precursors of moral admonitions. For he was a great individualist, that original. He suffered none other than himself. So through the long generations, this heavy precursor, this ancestor of all of us, fought and bred and perished, changing almost imperceptibly. Yet he changed. That keen chisel of necessity which sharpened the tiger's claw age by age, and fined down the clumsy orchippus to the swift grace of the horse, was at work upon him, is at work upon him still. The clumsier and more stupidly fierce among him were killed soonest and oftenest. The finer hand, the quicker eye, the bigger brain, the better balanced body prevailed, age by age. The implements were a little better made, the man a little more delicately adjusted to his possibilities. He became more social, his herd grew larger, no longer did each man kill or drive out his growing sons. A system of taboos made them tolerable to him, and they revered him alive and soon even after he was dead, and were his allies against the beasts and the rest of mankind. But they were forbidden to touch the women of the tribe. They had to go out and capture women for themselves, and each son fled from his stepmother and hid from her, lest the anger of the old man should be roused. All the world over, even to this day, these ancient inevitable taboos can be traced. And now instead of caves came huts and hovels, and the fire was better tended, and there were wrappings and garments. And so aided, the creature spread into colder climates, carrying food with him, storing food, until sometimes the neglected grass seed sprouted again and gave a first hint of agriculture. And already there were the beginnings of leisure and thought. Man began to think. There were times when he was fed, when his lusts and his fears were all appeased, when the sun shone upon the squatting place and dim stirrings of speculation lit his eyes. He scratched upon a bone and found resemblance and pursued it, and began pictorial art, molded the soft, warm clay of the river bank between his fingers, and found a pleasure in its patternings and repetitions, shaped it into the form of vessels, and found that it would hold water. He watched the streaming river, and wondered from what bountiful breast this incessant water came. He blinked at the sun, and dreamt that perhaps he might snare it and spear it as it went down to its resting place amidst the distant hills. Then he was roused to convey to his brother that once indeed he had done so, at least that someone had done so. He mixed that perhaps with another dream almost as daring, that one day a mammoth had been beset, and therewith began fiction, pointing away to achievement, and the august prophetic procession of tales. For scores and hundreds of centuries, for myriads of generations that life of our fathers went on. From the beginning to the ripening of that phase of human life, from the first clumsy eolith of rudely chipped flint to the first implements of polished stone, was 2,000 or 3,000 centuries, 10,000 or 15,000 generations. So slowly, by human standards, did humanity gather itself together out of the dim intimations of the beast. And that first glimmering of speculation, that first story of achievement, that storyteller bright-eyed and flushed under his matted hair, gesticulating to his gaping, incredulous listener, gripping his wrist to keep him attentive, was the most marvelous beginning this world has ever seen. It doomed the mammoths, and it began the setting of that snare that shall catch the sun. Section 2. That dream was but a moment in a man's life, whose proper business it seemed was to get food and kill his fellows, and beget after the manner of all that belongs to the fellowship of the beasts. About him, hidden from him by the thinnest of veils, were the untouched sources of power, whose magnitude we scarcely do more than suspect even today, power that could make his every conceivable dream come real. But the feet of the race were in the way of it, though he died blindly unknowing. At last, in the generous levels of warm river valleys, where food is abundant, and life very easy, the emerging human overcoming his earlier jealousies, becoming, as necessity persecuted him less urgently, more social and tolerant and amenable, achieved a larger community. There began a division of labor. Certain of the older men specialized in knowledge and direction. A strong man took the fatherly leadership in war, and priest and king began to develop their roles in the opening drama of man's history. The priest's solicitude was seed time and harvest and fertility, and the king ruled peace and war. In 100 river valleys about the warm, temperate zone of the earth there were already towns and temples, a score of thousand years ago. They flourished unrecorded, ignoring the past and unsuspicious of the future, for as yet writing had still to begin. Very slowly did man increase his demand upon the illimitable wealth of power that offered itself on every hand to him. He tamed certain animals, he developed his primordially haphazard agriculture into a ritual, he added first one metal to his resources and then another, until he had copper and tin and iron and lead and gold and silver to supplement his stone. He hewed and carved wood, made pottery, paddled down his river until he came to the sea, discovered the wheel and made the first roads. But his chief activity for 100 centuries and more was the subjugation of himself and others to larger and larger societies. The history of man is not simply the conquest of external power. It is first the conquest of those distrusts and fiercenesses, that self-concentration and intensity of animalism that tie his hands from taking his inheritance. The ape in us still resents association. From the dawn of the age of polished stone to the achievement of the peace of the world, man's dealings were chiefly with himself and his fellow man, trading, bargaining, law-making, propitiating, enslaving, conquering, exterminating, and every little increment in power he turned at once and always turns to the purposes of this confused, elaborate struggle to socialize. To incorporate and comprehend his fellow men into a community of purpose became the last and greatest of his instincts. Already before the last polished phase of the Stone Age was over, he had become a political animal. He made astonishingly far-reaching discoveries within himself, first of counting and then of writing and making records, and with that his town communities began to stretch out to dominion. In the valleys of the Nile, the Euphrates, and the great Chinese rivers, the first empires and the first written laws had their beginnings. Men specialized for fighting and rule as soldiers and knights. Later, as ships grew seaworthy, the Mediterranean which had been a barrier became a highway, and at last out of a tangle of pirate polities came the great struggle of Carthage and Rome. The history of Europe is the history of the victory and breaking up of the Roman Empire. Every ascendant monarch in Europe, up to the last, aped Caesar and called himself Kaiser or Tsar or Imperator or Kasir-i-Hind. measured by the duration of human life,